Hello, History of St. Louis, and welcome to our last unit, the famous families. We're going to begin by taking a look at the two famous beer families, the Bushes and the Lemps. Uh, but before we do that, because we're dealing with beer, my legal counsel has reminded me to remind you that this lecture in no way, shape, or form is meant to support, condone, encourage, recommend, entice, or promote the consumption of, drinking of, slamming of, bonging of, shotgunning of, sipping of, or any other form of intaking beer whatsoever. So now that we got the legal disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at beer in general. Beer has been around almost as long as humans have been around. Um, Chemically speaking, it's a pretty simple four ingredient uh, creation. Basically, you need water, you need some sort of starch. Most of the time, that's barley, but in more recent concoctions, wheat, rice, and corn have also been used to make beer. You need uh, yeast. Yeast is what gives it alcohol. And then finally, hops gives it its different flavors. So different hops give beers different flavors. And basically, beer is just manipulating these, maybe adding an extra ingredient or so, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But to understand beer a little bit better and to understand it in terms of the lemps and the bushes, you first need to understand that there are basically two styles of beer. One is ale. Ale is what we think of today with the Irish or the British. It is extremely dark in color. If you've ever seen a Guinness, which is probably the most well-known ale poured, it looks like motor oil. It is extremely thick and dark. It is also served at room temperature. You can serve ales cold, but traditionally they are served at room temperature. Um, and they are extremely bitter tasting. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have lager beer. Lager is more of the German style beer. And because St. Louis has a very strong German connection, that's what we think of when we think of beer. It is amber in color, like a light golden look. You can see through it, as with ale, you cannot. So, ale drinkers would say that lager is watered down beer. And then the other big difference is lager is brewed and stored cold. So you have to have a place to store it cold once it's been created. Um, the historic thing about lager beer is that we believe that the Lemps brought lager beer to America. And so that's going to be our historic connection to beer. But today there are a lot of ones that are fill right in the middle here. A lot of the microbreweries that you see around, especially in St. Louis, would come up with something called a pale ale, which would fit right in the middle. It'd be lighter than an ale, but it'd be darker than a lager beer. I've also seen a whole bunch of pale ales include fruit, so there's another ingredient. I've seen cherry beer, I've seen peach beer, I've seen uh, orange beer, I've seen chocolate beer, I've seen pumpkin spice beer during Halloween time period. So basically, any ingredient is up for grabs as long as you can make it taste palatable. But once again, you need to wait till you're 21. Now let's get into the Lemp family here. And the whole story of the Lemp family starts with Johann Adam Lemp, or just Adam Lemp as he's known in St. Louis. He's going to come from Eschwig, Germany, um, and come to St. Louis in 1838. But he comes here and he starts a grocery store basically where the south leg of the arch is today. So if you're looking at the arch and the river is in front of you, it's the leg to the right. And so his grocery store is somewhat successful, but one of the most successful things that he sells out of his grocery store is he sells a homemade beer, that lager beer that we're talking about. And because St. Louis has such a strong German connection, and a strong cultural connection in so many German immigrants who this is what they think of when they think of beer, they start buying his beer in droves. And eventually he is going to abandon the grocery store business and just focus on the beer. And for he and his family, that is going to be a monumentally good decision because it's going to bring him and his family major fortune. We believe that he is the first to brew lager beer in the United States. We know he's the first to do it in St. Louis. We historians now believe he's the first one to do it in the United States. It was basically between him and a brewer in Philadelphia, and we believe that Johann Adam Lemp beats him into that category. So we have probably the first lager brewery in the United States, thanks to the Lemps. So when Johann Adam Lemp dies, he's worth about $20,000. That's just shy of $1 million today. So he did very well for himself and his family and puts his family in a really good position. This is a picture of what his office and brewery look like. The office is the small little building. The brewery is the one right next to it. Um, and remember that they would have needed a place to keep things cold, and they will eventually find a cave system, which we will be talking about later on to do that. Once he starts to expand his brewery a little bit, this is at 2nd Street again, so this is right where the arch would have been. He does expand it, or actually this is his son when his son expands it a little bit, and then his son is going to move it, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. This is Johann Adam Lemp's grave. He is in Bellefontaine Cemetery, but he is not buried with his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He is buried by himself with his wife next to him. And so the next Lemp to take over is this gentleman right here, William Lemp Sr. And William Lemp Sr. is going to take the brewery from being a small little brewery to one of the largest, well, it will be the largest in St. Louis by the time that he dies. And so he realized that his father's brewery was too small. So in 1866, just after the Civil War, he will buy property in Soulard right off of Cherokee Street because of an underground cave system. That cave system will allow him to store and brew his beer in cold atmosphere. What they did was during the winter time, they would get ice chunks from the Mississippi River and take it down to the cave system and drop the cave temperature to 35 degrees. And so at that point in time, it was perfect to store beer. And because it was in a cave system, that ice would last for a while and keep the cave system pretty cold. And eventually that brewery is going to become a 5 city block brewery. And I'm going to show you pictures of it here in just a little bit. The next thing he's going to do is he's going to buy the house of his father-in-law, Jacob Fikert, and he's going to turn it into his office because the house was literally right down the street from the brewery. And so he would be able to live literally right down the street. Now, initially, the Lemp Mansion or the Fikert Mansion would be used for the offices of the Lemp Brewery, but eventually they're going to expand that house and turn it into their actual home. By 1870, the Lemp Brewery was the largest in St. Louis. So 4 years after they moved to Cherokee Street, they are the largest in St. Louis. In 1892, William Lemp Sr. will change it from the Western Brewery to the William J. Lemp Brewery, so he names it after himself, even though his father started it. And then he has a series of unfortunate circumstances. His favorite son, Frederick Lemp, who he was training to take over the brewery when he passed away, is going to die of some heart complications and dies at an early age, I want to say in his early 30s. That puts him in a major depression as any child's death would for a parent. And then Gustav Pabst, his best friend who lived in Milwaukee, If you've ever heard of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, this is the guy. He will also die uh, somewhat prematurely. And so these two deaths set off a major depression with William Lemp. And so he goes into an upper bedroom of the Lemp mansion and will be the first to shoot himself there, committing suicide. And so he basically is the first one to commit suicide in the Lemp mansion. It is stated that his spirit still haunts the mansion today. And the other thing that you'll need to know is that the beer that the Lemps make is called Falstaff. Falstaff was a Shakespearean character who liked to party, and so they figured that that was a good name for a beer. And so this is the history of William Lemp Sr. This is the Lemp Mansion today. The front has been changed a little bit over time. It had a little bit bigger front porch that has been taken away. So they simplified the front of the building, and then they added on to the back to make it its livable housing arrangement. Underneath the house is this cave system known as Cherokee Cave. And so you're going to want to know the name Cherokee Cave. And then there were entrances into the cave. So here you lifted the hatch and then you would climb down into the cave system. And that cave system went from the house, which is right over here, all the way to uh, the Lemp mansion or the Lemp Brewery, which was, I believe, down this way, if I'm reading this correctly. This is the Lemp Brewery, and it's 5 city blocks. And so each of the buildings had a different job within the brewery system. This is the power plant right here, and you can see by the large smokestack, and it would have had the name Lemp on it. And then over here you have the brew house. The brew house would have stored the barley and grain in these silos. And then it would have also held the hops as well as yeast. And so they made that over here. And then they would have, after they brewed it, they would have pumped it over here to the bottling company or the place where they would have put it into kegs. And then the shipping was these two buildings right here. And so all of these buildings are still standing today, but obviously they are not part of the Lemp Brewery anymore. There is no Lemp Brewery. The access to the caves uh, are somewhere in this complex right here. The Lemp name, as you can see, still stands on some of these buildings. As you see ISCO, and we'll explain what the ISCO stands for in just a little bit. Here's an up-close picture of the brew house with the tiled Lemp name at the top. Here's a different version of that same building. Today, they use some of this area for artists to make artistic projects to sell. They also have some flea markets in the parking lot area. Here are the children of William Lemp Sr. He has 9 of them. One of them, who is not pictured, was either mentally and physically handicapped child who they kept pretty hidden from public. Anna was then the second oldest, then William Lemp Jr., then Louis, then Charles, then Frederick, then Hilda, then Edwin, and then Elsa. And we're going to take a look at William Lemp Jr., we'll take a look at Charles, we're going to take a look at Edwin, and we'll take a look at Elsa. William Lemp Jr. Was the son of William Lemp Sr., and he will take over the brewery after his father's suicide in 1904. Obviously, growing up knowing that you are not your father's favorite child probably left some emotional scars with him that he and his father never really did overcome. He's also known for marrying and going through a very nasty public divorce with Lillian Hanlon, known in St. Louis as the Lavender Lady. She was known as the Lavender Lady because she was always seen in public wearing lavender. Now, I've heard two stories as to why that happened. One is that it was Billy Lemp's favorite color and he made her wear it. I've also heard that it was her favorite color and she just liked going out that way. Either way, she was known as the Lavender Lady because she was always seen in lavender. When they got divorced, he ends up building a new house out in the Sunset Hills, Kirkwood area named Allswell for 2.9 million. Today it was 125,000. I'm going to show you that house a little bit later on. The breweries are going to officially close in 1919 during Prohibition while he is in control of the Lemp Brewery. For a while, they will try to do things to get money coming in, including making a non-alcoholic beer that is successful for a short period of time, and then basically the business goes bad. And so he was basically forced to auction off the brewery. Um, they basically had their family fortune and they were fighting with each other. So he just said, I'm done. And he ends up selling it. But unfortunately for him, they don't get the payoff that they were hoping for. It was worth $7 million when Prohibition starts, but because nobody wants to own a brewery during Prohibition, they end up selling the building for $588,000, or basically less than a tenth of what it was worth. And they sell it to the International Shoe Company, who turns it into a shoe manufacturing plant. And that's why it says ISC on the outside of some of the Lemp buildings. And so the only thing that he was allowed to keep was the Lemp mansion, even though once he had remarried, he had moved out of there and let his brother live in the mansion. He had moved out. Basically, later in the year, when he had to sell off the brewery, he will go to the office of the brewery, which was in the Lemp mansion, which is now today the dining room on the left side. He will close the door and get out the same type of gun that his father did, and he will become the second Lemp to commit suicide in the Lemp mansion. People say that the left-hand dining room is one of the more haunted places in the Lemp mansion. And this is basically how St. Louis dealt with Prohibition. They just started pumping alcohol into the streets and draining it into the sewer system. Here they are just unloading illegal shipments of alcohol. Here they're actually busting into the breweries and making holes in the wall so that they can just let it flow right on out into the streets. When William Lemp Jr. committed suicide, it was on the front page of the Post-Dispatch. It was big news back then. This is his house and what it looks like today. This is Allswell. This is the mansion that he had built, and it overlooks the Merrimack River in South St. Louis. This is what it looked like when he made it. So it was made to look like a German hunting lodge. This is what it looks like today. Lillian Hanlon, after her divorce, will go ahead and live a pretty secluded life from the public. She moves into an apartment in the central West End near what is today the Chase Park Plaza. And then when she dies, she requests that she be buried next to her child, William Lemp III, who was in the Lemp mausoleum in Bellefonte Cemetery, and the family agreed. And she is buried to the right of her son, and her husband is buried to the left of the son, so that they would not be together, but they are both next to their child. Their child was William Lemp III, and after Prohibition, he tried to revive the Lemp Brewery, and he was trying to coordinate the finances and tweak the recipe a little bit and get the LEMP brewery going. It looked like he might have been able to do it, but he dies of a heart attack in 1943, and that really puts any final end in the hopes that the LEMP brewery will start back up again. And so he's sort of the last hope, if you will, and that dies with him. So the last LEMP to live in the LEMP mansion is Billy's younger brother, Charles Lemp. Here's a picture of Charles Lemp later in age. He basically moves into the house after William Lemp dies, Billy Lemp dies, and he basically becomes sort of a recluse where he accepts no visitors. He does have a couple people that help him keep up the house who stay with him, and those are the only ones that he lets in the house. Eventually, he's going to develop a serious case of gout, which is inflammation of the joints and can be very painful. And it was so painful that he had to move his second-story bedroom to the first story, or what is now the bar area in the Lemp mansion, because he couldn't walk up the major set of stairs to get to the second floor bedrooms. He is considered probably somebody who suffered from OCD. He was a germaphobe, and he, again, was a recluse. He did not want anybody coming into his house because he was afraid that they would bring germs in. He is the only suicide in the Lemp mansion where somebody writes a letter. It says over here, "In case I am found dead, blame it on no one but me, Charles A. Lemp." But before he commits suicide, he's going to kill his dog because he did not want to be left alone in the afterlife. So he shoots his dog first, then he shoots himself. And it is said that both he and the dog haunt the Lemp mansion today. And so that's the story behind the death of Charles Lemp. This is Elsa Lemp. She is actually the only Lemp to commit suicide outside of the Lemp mansion. And chronologically speaking, she's actually the second Lemp to commit suicide. So the order of the suicides goes her father, William Lemp Sr., then her, then William Lemp Jr., and then Charles. She lives in a house in the central West End on a street called Horton's Place. She lives at number 13 Horton's Place. And when I took this photo, I really wanted to ring the doorbell and ask the family if they knew the story of what had happened in their house, but I just didn't have enough guts to do it. Basically, she and her husband, by the name of Thomas Wright, end up having a pretty rocky marriage. They end up separating for a little bit and then getting back together. When they get back together, she then started suffering from some depression and maybe some stomach issues, possibly related to the depression. The pain gets so bad that one day she goes into the bathroom and shoots herself. The maid and Thomas Wright, instead of calling the police, call her brother Billy Lemp. Billy rushes from the Lemp mansion to Central West End, and in the process of driving over there gets involved in a car accident. And when asked why he was driving so fast, he said, "Something has happened to my sister." And the police said, "Well, we haven't heard anything." And so they follow him, and when they arrive at the house and they see the dead woman in the bathroom, the police suspect foul play, but the maid ends up corroborating that Elsa Lemp had killed herself. And so that's sort of the unfortunate end of Elsa Lemp. I will go back and say that one of the interesting things, when Billy Lemp arrived at the house and saw his sister laying there on the floor, he supposedly made the comment, "That's the Lemp family for you," kind of foreshadowing what would happen, and a pretty cold thing to say about your sister's death, I would imagine. The only Lemp that ends up having a long prosperous life is the youngest son, Edwin, who really walked away from the brewery because he did believe that the Lemp family was cursed. And so he wanted nothing to do with the Lemp mansion. He wanted nothing to do with the Lemp brewery. He moved out of the Lemp mansion as soon as he could. And when his brother Charles dies, he will basically take all of the possessions of the Lemp mansion and all of the records of the Lemp brewery and put them in a major fire and burn them all. That is why there is very little original furniture from the Lemp mansion at the Lemp mansion, and that's because Edwin burned it all. Edwin is probably one of the major forefathers for the St. Louis Zoo. He used his fortune to purchase a number of the animals that will make the zoo an early attraction, really sets it on its path to success. Like his brother, he will also build a major estate in the Kirkwood Sunset Hills area called Craigwald. It also overlooks the Merrimack River, but stylistically, it's a much different looking house. This is the Lemp Mausoleum. All of the gentlemen and ladies that we discussed are buried here, with the exception of Johann Adam Lemp, the first one. So all of the Lemps are buried inside of the Lemp Mausoleum. We've already seen the Lemp Mausoleum. Here you can see a picture of the nameplates of the different Lemps that are here. Frederick Lemp was the first to be buried in the Lemp Mausoleum. That is the first Lemp. That was William Lemp Sr.'s favorite son. He is the first one to die, and so he really is the first one to be in there. This is Craigwald. This is the estate of Edwin Lemp. You can see the Fachwerk German design in the style of the house, and we studied that before, and you can see the stone base of the house as well. This is what it looks like from the Merrimack River down below. So it looks sort of like a fortress, if you will. Here's another picture of it. And then underneath the Lemp mansion, because they were rich, they were able to do things in the cave system that nobody else would be able to do. Right here to the right of the picture, it looks like it's a sunken area. That is the pool or spa, if you will, of the Lemp family. They basically ran a heating pipe from the brewery to the house, and they heated the water in the pool. So it was more like a spa than it was a swimming pool, but they did have an underground pool spa area. And then here's another look of what it looked like. This is the pool area. And then the other thing that they had was this theater area. And so basically when a famous singer or act would come to St. Louis to perform, the Lemps would pay them extra money to give the family their own personal show at night. And they would do it in the Lemp Theater, which was part of the underground cave system. And this is what remains of their theater area in the cave. Eventually in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, the Cherokee cave system could be walked through as part of a tour. But then when insurance became too expensive, they had to shut things down. But this is what the cave system looked like in the parts that they did not use for the Lemp Brewery. And then here is a picture of one of the Lemp beer wagons that would have shipped beer. So basically, back in this time, beer was only sold in the city that it was made in, that you would not be able to ship it nationally because they didn't have the ability to keep it cold. So the beer was shipped locally, and it was basically had to consume it within that 24, 48 hours. And so you had beer wagons roaming all around St. Louis, delivering their beers to their local saloons. That's our look at the Lemps. We will pick up with the Bushes tomorrow. Thanks for listening.